episode of Nothing But Dicta, the podcast where everyone has an opinion and you get to hear it. Today's podcast will be hosted by 1L Dominique Rouge.
Thank you. So, I'm Dominique. I'm looking forward to interviewing Professor Gambert. Professor Gambert is the current director of the Writing Center at GW Law, and she's the interim director of the Fundamentals of Lawyering program. She also teaches feminist legal theory and a seminar in gender, race, and species. At the beginning of her own legal career, she was the program director of womenslaw.org, a national nonprofit organization providing state-specific legal information to domestic violence survivors. She also clerked for Judge Ronna Lee Beck at the D.C. Superior Court. Her most recent scholarship has been around the word milk. The word milk itself, she writes, in verb form means to exploit, and it's milk's relationship to exploitation and oppression that interests her most. Her research on the subject has received a lot of attention in the media, particularly her Brooklyn Law Review article entitled Got Milk, spelled with a Y, The Disruptive Possibilities of Plant Milk. So she's also a senior fellow at Sentient Media, a nonprofit media organization that works to create transparency around animal rights and the planetary crisis created by global factory warming. And she's published numerous articles in the field of legal writing, has presented at legal writing conferences, and served on the board of directors of the Legal Writing Institute.
Yes, really good to meet you both. I am really excited to have this conversation with you.
What inspired you to become vegan?
I became a vegetarian when I was 12 years old, and I really credit my friendship with a bunch of cows who lived in Norway with my decision to become a vegetarian when I was a kid. I'm half Norwegian and grew up spending my summers in Norway, and my family has a cabin, which is a pretty common thing in Norwegian culture, to have a cabin kind of off the grid without running water, without cell phone access, although there was no cell phones that existed when I was growing up. I mean, you're really isolated and in the middle of the wilderness. And I spent every summer at this cabin, and a few minutes walk down this gravel path from where my family's cabin is a very small mountain dairy farm called a seter. And that seter has been in existence for hundreds of years. And my family and the family that runs the seter have known each other for centuries. And there's about 20 cows who live up and down the valley who spend their summers at this cabin or at this cabin area. And they end up, being milked in the morning, and then they're released into the wilderness and they roam around. They have hundreds of acres to roam around in the mountains and drink from the streams, and they have this really idyllic life. And because it's such an isolating place, I didn't have friends or really anyone to hang out with there other than my few family members. And so just like I had cats at my home in New York where I grew up, I really befriended these cows and got to know them well, and really got to know their names, their personalities, and got to really love them the way I loved my cats and see them as individuals. And I also spent several summers or sort of apprenticing at this dairy farm and milking the cows and learning how to care for them. And it was a really meaningful experience for me. So I had this realization when I was about 12 that my relationship to these cows, which felt very idyllic, was only part of their lives, and that there were so many aspects of their lives that I wasn't privy to and that I wasn't seeing. And I read a book at that time that said something like cows can sense when they're being brought to slaughter, and they actually cry tears of grief when they or their friends, for lack of a better word, are being walked to the slaughterhouse. And I'd never thought about these cows' lives outside of their relationship to me as a 12-year-old kid in this really idyllic place. And then I came to realize that the milk that we were milking them for only existed because they had become pregnant, these cows, and had calves. And those calves had been separated from them at birth or shortly thereafter. And that's the only way that a cow or really any mammal would create the lactation process, is by having a baby. And these cows didn't spontaneously become pregnant. Human beings were impregnating them through artificial insemination. And I had heard from the people that worked at the farm that it was really difficult to separate mother cows from their calves, and they would cry for days, and sometimes they would break down fences to try to get to where they thought their babies were. And then of course cows can live to be 20 years old or older, but are typically killed a decade before that when they're no longer commercially viable for their milk and they're sold off for meat. So I had all of these realizations when I was 12, and I just thought, how can I be, eating these friends? I just don't understand that. And why are we humans, how is it our place to do this to another living thing? We have done similar things actually to each other as humans at very dark times in our history as humans, where we have taken away liberties or controlled bodily autonomy in ways that I think are reprehensible. And I just sort of reflected that I don't think that it's our place as humans to be having that kind of, power and control over the lives of other living things. And I certainly shouldn't be benefiting from it. I didn't want to be a part of the commodification of these mothers, I guess. So I became a vegetarian, but I continued eating dairy. And I lived with this really powerful cognitive dissonance from age 12 to 27, and I'm 40 now. So from those years, from 12 to 27, I knew at some level that eating dairy was not significantly different than eating meat in terms of my desire to cut myself off of the commodification of these, of other living things. Because of course, drinking milk or having butter or ice cream or whatever comes from cows in the same system of exploitation that I was opposed to that made me become a vegetarian. But I think I just couldn't see how I could, successfully be vegan in a non-vegan world. It just seemed like too challenging at the time in the early mid-90s. And then it just wasn't something that I understood that was possible for me because of how dominant in our culture eating animals and animal products is. That is really the norm in a way that I find really problematic, but it's the norm that we've all been socialized to live within. I often say that to me, being vegan isn't really a diet. I mean, it's very much a worldview.
How did becoming vegan affect your view of the law?
Being vegan, I think, opens your eyes to the very powerful systems of oppression that are in place to give some people power and take it away from others. And humans have been using the law to do that for all time, since we've been creating laws. And I taught a course in feminist legal theory this past spring, and I'll be teaching a seminar called Gender, Race, and Species this coming spring that's interested in looking at these systems of oppression that laws have been created to sort of legitimize and perpetuate. And I'm not conflating the exploitation or oppression of women or of people of color with non-human animals at all, but I do think that there's a commonality underneath those different distinct oppressions, which is that we have very powerful structures that are in place that have legitimized and made legal very distinct forms of oppression, discrimination, and exploitation. And looking at the ways in which non-human animals are continually exploited and seen and otherized and seen as, lesser than and not given, rights to their bodily autonomy or rights to their life or to their offspring makes me realize how far we've come in a lot of ways with our legal systems in relationship to each other as humans, but also how far we have to go.
What are some of the legal issues that are most important to you as a vegan?
Something that I spend a lot of time in my scholarship thinking about and writing about is maybe not even the thing that is the most pressing to my mind. So I'll get to that. But the thing I think about and write about a lot is the way that there's a current trend to try to use the law to perpetuate the consumption of animal products and to make it harder and harder for advocates of plant-based food to try to inspire people to buy those products instead. So one small example is there's a lot of lawsuits and court cases and proposed legislation and legislation that's even passed in the US and Canada and Europe and other places that has made it illegal for plant-based companies to use words like milk or cheese or burger on a carton of soy milk or oat milk or vegan cheese or yogurt or veggie burger. I think that the efforts being made by the animal agriculture industry and their advocates to put those prohibitions into place are actually being done out of a fear that the animal agriculture industry is being disrupted by an increased interest that people have in veganism and in plant-based eating, and an increased awareness around animal welfare and wellness issues. And those industries are feeling threatened because they've been able to carry on really exploitative practices behind the closed doors of their slaughterhouses for a really long time. And now that people are interested in, knocking on the door and opening the door and looking inside and seeing the suffering that takes place inside, not only the suffering of the non-human animals, but also of the human workers that are working in these factories, which are predominantly people of color and immigrants that are working in slaughterhouses and have jobs that are filled with a lot of workplace injuries, mental and physical trauma. I think those industries are scared that dairy milk sales have been decreasing and plant milk sales have been increasing. So one of the most interesting things I think right now happening in the law are these, I call them like the milk wars, are these battles around the space that language around food even occupies, like the cultural space that words occupy around what we even conceptualize as food.
So then what legislation would you like to see passed?
I'd love to see legislation that says you can use the word milk or meat or cheese on those products and that is allowed. And those products would also come with an identifier. So it wouldn't just say milk on the bottle, it would say oat milk or soy milk. Arguably, dairy milk should maybe say cow milk, right? We should know where it comes from. As a vegan, I often get questions like, oh, can you eat bread? Can you eat pasta? And I'm like, well, does the bread have egg in it? Does the pasta have egg in it? And people are like, can you have butter? And I'm like, do you even know where butter comes from? And I think that our relationship as, humans living in a very industrialized society, our relationship to the food that we eat we have such a distance from it that we don't even know what the products we're eating, what ingredients are in them. And if we don't know, what is butter made out of? Oh, it's made from milk that came from a cow that had a baby that was taken away from her so that she would lactate. I mean, I think that if we're going to be eating animal products, if a person wants to eat an animal product, they sort of owe it out of respect to the animal to know exactly what her life was like. That produced that product that person is choosing to eat, that ice cream bar or that butter on their toast or whatever. So anyway, I would like the laws to make it clear that we can label food, plant-based vegan food, that we don't have to shy away from words that describe them. But I think maybe even a more bold thing that I would love to see, but probably not in my lifetime, is a world that really takes a hard look at this question of, are animals food at all? Do we even see animals as food products? Why? That's a bolder question to ask, I think, in the world that we live in today. But, the world that I would want to live in is a world where nobody actually wants to be exploiting other animals, just to eat things that they think taste delicious. And I think there's so many other things in the world, there's so many other sources of food that are not so bound up with, suffering, that I would love to see both our culture and our laws align with a world that was interested in really just getting rid of animal exploitation in all of its forms. That's a more radical view that like I said, I don't know if I'll live to see that day, but that's in my dreams.
Are there any shifts in thinking that you would offer to students starting to learn the law? Any lessons maybe from your life that you either wish you'd known in law school or you would like law students to be aware of now?
Thanks for that question. I think it's a really good one and an important one. I think it's really important that all of us as law-trained people, and frankly as lay people, but especially people learning the law, to question it. And just because it appears in a book, a court case, anywhere, a constitution, to question it and to remember who wrote those laws and to question whether or not they're serving the world as it is today and also as we want it to become, because we are creating the world that we want to live in. And one of the most powerful things about laws are that we can recognize when they are serving us and we can recognize when they are not, and that we need to change them. I would just encourage law students to look at the laws that they're learning about critically and to, yes, have respect for them, but also have respect for the generations of people that have struggled to change them over time to make them what they are today, to the extent that they are just and equitable and serve us well. And to also be inspired by those struggles to say, we're on a long continuum and we step into this stream and say, how do we change and shape the laws for the world that we want to create in the future?
Thank you very much, Professor Gambert. I will be thinking about this conversation for a very long time. So I'm really grateful for it. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's been so great being here and talking with you. And yeah, I really encourage anyone that's interested in any of the topics that we've talked about here today to get in touch with me. I love speaking to law students about any of these topics. And it's just an honor to talk with you today. So thank you.
Well, that's all the time we have for today. If you liked this podcast, please subscribe to our YouTube page. And as always, tune in again for another episode of Nothing But Dicta.